Good evening to everybody. My name is Evan Weiner. I have been at the library before, and I need to start my video, don't I? There we go. It's always a pleasure to come back to Carmel, to the Reed Library, and thank you, Jean, for inviting me. Tonight, I'm going to talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Barbados. And I speak on cruise ships. Well, I used to speak on cruise ships. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do so or not in the next year. But among the places I have stopped on cruise ships are Bridgetown, Barbados, Halifax, Nova Scotia, up in Cape Breton, Sydney, Nova Scotia, and Quebec City. And there's even Pittsburgh in this thing. And as I went through the cruise ships, and as you go from port to port, there are things that, like in Bridgetown, there's not much to do in Bridgetown other than going swimming in Barbados. And my wife and I were walking back to the cruise ship, and there's a series of plaques as you walk to the cruise ship on the wall, talking about Barbados and some of the accomplishments of Barbados. And one of the accomplishments of Barbados is the Charter of 1652, ending the war between England and Barbados, the Civil War. And within that text, there's a lot of stuff that ended up in the Declaration of Independence. In Washington, the only time he was off the North American continent was the time that he was on in Barbados because his brother was sick. And also there's Quebec City, and there is Cape Breton and Halifax. So some of this history you probably know, but a lot of this history you don't know because it's not taught in schools. Maybe it's taught in Barbados, maybe it's taught up in Canada, but when I went to school, it wasn't taught in school. And there is George Washington. That is on Central Park West, one of the museums up in the 80s and 90s. And George probably didn't pose for that statue, at least in that part of New York. But anyway, George had a brother, half-brother by the name of Lawrence Washington. That's the Washington Monument a few years ago. Had a couple problems that they had to fix up. And I always thought, because Washington seems to be always broken, going back to the days of Washington, it's a pretty good picture of the Washington Monument being fixed. But Washington would go to Barbados with his brother, who was suffering from tuberculosis, when he was about 19 years old, and that would change his life and, ironically, change the lives of all of us who are Americans, because possibly without George Washington, we might have been British citizens longer, or maybe not. We might have been Canadians. Now, let's go back to 1649. Go back to 1649, and this is why Washington and Barbados is somewhat important. Barbados was intimately involved in the English Civil War, which resulted in the defeat and the execution of King Charles I in 1649 and the rise to power of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. The war would come to Barbados as Barbados became a haven, not a haven, it became a major trading center, the biggest trading center in the Atlantic and the Caribbean anyway, and you could say in North America, even though it's not part of North America. So the war comes to Barbados in 1651, and it would end with the Charter of Barbados. The royalists who supported King Charles fled to Barbados, and they didn't want to lose their heads, like the king. Hey, you never know. The king lost his head. So they buy property in Barbados, and they become Barbadians. And they're running the show in Barbados. They got away. The loyalists, they were the loyalists, they were the royalists, and yet they would become the traitors very quickly. The Charter of Barbados was agreed upon January 11th and ratified, where else? We're talking about Brits, in a tavern, the Mermaid Tavern in Ostends on January 17th. There were 23 articles in that treaty addressed religious liberty, free trade, taxation, and the authority of the local assembly. The people in Barbados, the former royalists and loyalists who fled, wanted to make sure that there was no taxation without representation. And that's the big thing that Jefferson would, and the others who were involved in the Revolutionary War in the United States about 125 years later, they would draw from this treaty, which was signed in a tavern. The Civil War, the Charter of Barbados, all done, January 17th, 1652. That is the plaque that I was talking about that got me to start thinking about, hey, you know what, this might not be a bad talk. From this vantage point, you could have witnessed one of the naval theaters of the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. Sir Charles Askew commanded a naval blockade of the island of Barbados from his ship, the Rainbow, in Ostins Bay. From October 1651 to January 1652, Askew's naval forces were sent to subdue local royalists, guys from England who fled, led by Governor Lord Willoughby. The stalemate ended in a treaty between the royalists and the parliamentarian factions after the final conflict in Ostins. The Charter of Barbados was signed on 11 January 1652 at the Mermaid Tavern in Ostins. It guaranteed barbarian colonists their rights to land, local control of taxation, liberty of conscience, access to courts of law, and limited free trade. Some of that you might have learned in elementary school or junior high school whenever you were taught American history, but you were never taught where that came from Thomas Jefferson. And some of it comes from the Ostins Bay Treaty back in 1652, although some of this writing was floating around in the 1940s back in the day. But a lot of what Jefferson did comes from the Treaty of Ostins. So this is 1652. The treaty: no taxes, customs, imports, loans, or excise shall be laid nor levy made on any inhabitants of this island without their general consent in the General Assembly. That's the Article 3, Charter of Barbados. And Thomas Jefferson would lift that for the Declaration of Independence about 125 years later. So where'd the Boston Tea Party start? Well, maybe not Boston. In fact, it may have started in Nova Scotia, who the Nova Scotians whispering to their cousins down in Massachusetts. The Mermaid Taverns in Ostins was the site of the final battle between the Royalists and the Roundheads, and it resulted in the Charter of Barbados Treaty of Ostins, articles of rendition of the island from proprietary rights to a Commonwealth Parliament, January 11, 1652. I have no doubt that Jefferson, because he was as smart as he was, did study what happened in Barbados. The question is, where did he get the information? The answer may be George Washington. Taxation without representation. The treaty was to ensure that Barbados accepted the authority of the English Parliament and also prevented the local tax from being raised without local consent. Again, where did Jefferson get this from? Now, some of the Barbadians ended up in the Carolinas and in Virginia. And of course, Jefferson was born in Virginia, in Monticello, and lived there. So it is possible that some people in the Carolinas and the Virginias, he got to know them, or people who had background in Barbados, and they talked about this, or George Washington told them about it. The Treaty of Ostins was negotiated. No taxation without representation was the inspiration for the Boston Tea Party in 1773, and subsequently included in the American Declaration of Independence. That's Barbados' one claim to fame. The other, well, there's Thomas Jefferson, when you could go to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington and park for nothing. You have to pay for parking now in front of the Jefferson Memorial. Who Jefferson talked to? Who influenced him on the Declaration of Independence? It's hard to tell. It doesn't seem to be that there is one central influence, or at least Jefferson never talked about it. But the charter would influence the Declaration of Independence, and George Washington probably found out about it on his visit in 1751. And he may have been acquainted with the charter, and that's where the link between Jefferson and Washington might be. But nobody has ever firmly established a link between Washington and Jefferson on this particular issue. Now, get the violins here, because this is going to be a tear-jerking story. Lawrence Washington, George Washington's half-brother, was suffering from tuberculosis. And doctors said, hey, you know what? We may have a cure for you. This is what you got to do. Go down to the tropics. Go down to Barbados. It's a good place. Bridgetown's the biggest city in North America. A lot of trade there. And you have an uncle there, don't you? Gedney Clark. Yeah, you got an uncle there. And just get
We lost the sound.
Yeah, we lost the audio, Evan.
Okay, how about now?
Got it back.
Okay,
Good.
thanks. Hopefully it'll stay, and hopefully I could tell all these stories. Anyway, so he talks to people, and he finally goes, hey, George, you want to come? George said, sure. He's a 19-year-old surveyor. George never did go to the best schools. Generally, somebody of their rank in North America would go over to England to the best schools, but he never did. The brothers apparently sailed on a ship called the Success, small trading sloop. Now, where they are in Virginia, let's say Charleston, South Carolina, that's a cruise port. It would take about 2 days to go from Charleston, South Carolina to Barbados, 3 days, if you went quickly. This voyage would take 6 weeks, and this is right from Mount Vernon. It's on the walls of Mount Vernon, Washington's home. And he talks about the trip on the Success and the Atlantic Ocean. He had never been on the ocean before. And he called the Atlantic fickle and merciless. Notice how he spelled merciless, M-E-R-C-I-L-I, not an E-S-S. Merciless Ocean. And that's the place he ended up staying. That's what it looks like today. It's Gedney Clark's place. And they are going to go, and Lawrence Washington presumably is going to relax in the backyard under the Barbadian sun, maybe go quickly over to the beach and recover from tuberculosis. Meanwhile, George has nothing to do while he's there. Some more details about that ship going to Barbados that took 6 months, whatever, 6 weeks. Details about sailing, the fish they caught or tried to catch, dolphin, pilotfish, shark, barracudas, or tigerfish. By November 2nd, 1751, 19-year-old George Washington finally is in Bridgetown, Barbados. But chances are he didn't see that when he got there, but he actually was on Carlisle Bay, one of the beaches there. Barbados was surrounded by 200-meter deep shelf, and it was basically an island. That's all it was, but it was a strategic island because of the slave trade in the Caribbean, and the money went to Barbados. The English settled the island in 1627. About 2 decades later, Europeans found out that sugar was good. Sugar would become king. And there'd be fights in Europe over sugar. Everybody wanted sugar. Well, there was the sugar trade and there was the slave trade in Barbados. Europeans went over and established the slave trade and also the sugar trade. Barbados was one of Britain's most precious colonial possessions. Bridgetown was one of the most populous cities in British America, and more than likely the biggest city that Washington was in until, say, the 1770s. After all, there was no Washington, D.C., which would have been closest to his house in Mount Vernon. Of course, there was a Baltimore at that point, Richmond. But more than likely that Washington had never seen a place that populated. His uncle was Gedney Clark, and Washington's wife, an uncle of Lawrence Washington's wife, and he invited them down to the house. They went. Now, Washington had some reluctance about staying at the place because Mrs. Clark had smallpox. That was a problem. He didn't want to be exposed to smallpox. But guess what? Within 2 weeks, he had the disease. And I don't know if he was wearing one of these while he was down there, a mask, but he was stricken with the disease. So he's stuck with his brother who's recovering from tuberculosis and Lawrence's aunt by marriage, because they were half brothers, George Washington, Lawrence Washington. And he's stuck in the house with smallpox, which was a deadly disease back in the day. And I guess there's still some smallpox around in some laboratory somewhere that they haven't totally eradicated the disease. So he's got a problem. But finally, he gets over smallpox, which would help him in the Revolutionary War many, many years later. And somehow he gets involved with the British Navy. And he's looking at the island, and he's looking at the defenses. Now, this guy was not a military man. He was just a surveyor at this point. And he concluded that Barbados was one entire, I-N-T-I-R-E, instead of E-N-T-I-R-E, one entire fortification. And to this day, if you go to Barbados, that wall is still there with some of the cannons facing out. The Barbadian Navy is down in Bridgeport at the dock, 3 ships. But Barbados was the crown jewel, and Britain did whatever it could to protect it back then. They would go home, the brothers. Lawrence Washington would die of tuberculosis in Mount Vernon, July of 1752. Washington, meanwhile, is no longer a teenager. He's in his 20s, and he decides he's going to go out and look at the rest of the world. His provincial world was expanded, and while he was in Barbados, he made contact with all sorts of influential people, both in the military and also in private business. You gotta remember, they were all Brits, right? Washington's a Brit at this point, so is Jefferson, and others as well. And these people would be there for the rest of his career, from 1752 to the end of his presidency in 1797. He returns to Virginia, and he says, you know what? I like this military stuff. I'm gonna go in. And he decides to go in. And he goes into the British military. He knows all about the Navy, and he's going to learn all about warfare in the parts of Virginia, of course, that are mountainous. He's not mountainous where he is in Mount Vernon over by the Atlantic Ocean. So he's going to learn totally about the military. He learns more about the military than any other person in Virginia. He did seek a commission in the regular British Army. He wanted to be part of the British Army. It was an ambition that he probably got while he was in Barbados. Hey, I'll become an army man. Also, you got to remember, George was 6'4". He stood head and shoulders above everybody else. He was a big, tall, strong guy and a young guy. And he had a lot of ambition, an awful lot of ambition. And he was probably good military material. Washington becomes the commander of the Virginia militia in December of 1752. And that was because they taught him everything in Barbados. It was like basic training for Washington in Barbados. He would see action in the French and Indian War, and eventually he was put in charge of all of Virginia's militia forces. In 1753, 21 years old. He's 21 years old at the time. Washington was sent as an ambassador from the British Crown to French officials and Indians near Erie, Pennsylvania, which was actually part of New York. New York sold the port of Erie to Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania didn't have any ports over at on the lake at that point, Lake Erie. And so anyway, so he's there in Erie and he's trying to meet with these people, and he does. In 1754, he was there at the beginning of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was assisting construction of Fort Pitt in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But before reaching that point, he and some of his men, accompanied by Indian allies, were ambushed by a French scouting party. Its leader was killed. One of Washington's setbacks is coming. The French responded by attacking fortifications that Washington erected following the ambush, and he surrendered. He's released on parole. He and his troops go back to Virginia, the first defeat of George Washington's career. He decides, you know what? I'm having problems with Braddock. I'm having problems doing all of this, even though they loved him in terms of the English. He's the tough guy, real tough guy. He did something wrong, no problem. He'd give you 40 lashes. If you deserted it, he'd kill you. So he's a real tough guy. So he becomes a surveyor, but he gets involved in the military again and is in the middle of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, 1756. But there's a problem. In his first year, he's doing well. First year, and he's about 24, 25 years old. He's the commander of the Virginia Regiment, and he shapes the unit into one of the best provincial military units in the colonies. Oh, he was a disciplinarian. He was a major disciplinarian, punishing transgressions with the lash. And hey, you tried to desert, he'd find you, and then he'd hang you. But there were a lot of battlefield losses. He wasn't the greatest in terms of being a general. And then there were the fights with Governor Robert Dinwiddie, and he would return to Williamsburg, and that's it. I'm done. My military career is done by the time I'm 25. I'm just going to go back. I'll go back to Martha and do whatever I have to do in Mount Vernon, running the farm. So he's gone. But while he is gone, a whole bunch of things are taking place. He gets married. He's 26 years old. He marries Martha Dandridge Custis. She's very rich. They would never have any children. But he decides he's going to go into politics. And in 1759, he lived on the plantation, and he becomes a politician, the Virginia House of Burgesses. Meanwhile, while he is gone, he has missed a lot of action, which would eventually impact him. Frontenac, Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City. To the left, your left, is the Plains of Abraham there. And this is, rather it would be to the right in this picture because it's Quebec City Hall. So we're looking toward the St. Lawrence Seaway here. Anyway, so Plains of Abraham to the right. And this is a quick personal story. The National Hockey League held its draft in Quebec City in 1993, and my son was a little upset about something. And there was a hockey player who I have known for a long time, Anders Hedberg, and it got me to thinking actually a long time ago. And he says, "Can I, talk to your son?" I said, "Sure." And he puts his arm around my son, who's 8 years old at the time, and he says, "Look over there." He said, "Just look over there. Do you realize that you're standing on sacred ground here? Do you realize that the fate of North America was decided about 100 yards from you right here, and that life changed significantly for everybody, at least the 13 colonies and the northern colonies, right there when the English army, Wolfe, defeated Montcalm on that field over there." And there is where Montcalm died. This was Canada. This is Quebec. And the French had been there for a while, and they're routed by the English. And that starts up the Anglophile-Francophile war that is still being fought today in Canada. And there is the fortress looking down at St. Lawrence Seaway, St. Lawrence Seaway down there. And it was never fully built by the French. Had they slowly built it. They figured there were rocks and crags and hills that nobody had ever come up, and they were safe in the upper town up there. And they miscalculated because the English came in a fog and went sideways, got onto the plains of Abraham. 15-minute battle. Wolfe wins. Montcalm is dead, and North American history has changed. Washington is sitting in Virginia as a politician. Well, he's not even a politician quite yet. He's still a bachelor at this point, 1758. And this is where this would have impact on George Washington's life. And there is the plaque to Montcalm, defeated here. He received his mortal wounds, actually 1759, on September 13th, 1759. That's where North America changes. Well, at least the eastern part of North America, because there was the Spanish down in Mexico. In 1759, the British, under the command of James Wolfe, the general, besieged Quebec City for 3 months. That city was defended by the French general, Marquis de Montcalm. And that's pretty much near where Montcalm lost his life, and the British troops come up the side and surprise the French and sack the French there. And that was not the only place that the French were sacked. Over in Nova Scotia, they were sacked there too. And that is the view looking down from the wall, from the St. Lawrence Seaway, and to the right of that is the little crag that the British troops climbed to get onto the plains of Abraham. 1605, the French colonists established the first permanent European settlement in future Canada, in the first north of Florida at Port Royal, and it would be Acadia, which brings me over to Nova Scotia. Louisbourg, a French settlement in 1713. 1730, it was the biggest military fortress in North America. It fell in 1758. Now, the Treaty of Utrecht gave Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island to the French. And the French wanted to use that and Nova Scotia, New Scotland, Nova Scotia. And they want to set up base with Quebec. They thought they had a good shot at it. That's a recreation of the fort, which was sacked by the English about 1758. And started what was to be ethnic cleansing of Cape Breton and Nova Scotia. Louisbourg was captured by the British 1758. It had been demolished. Some of you might have read the poem Evangeline by Longfellow. And Longfellow wrote this about this woman, Evangeline, who doesn't know where her husband is. The English have captured him. And the English right now are ready to cleanse Nova Scotia of any French man. Women stayed behind with children. And that's the light tower over near the fort, the oldest light tower in Eastern Canada. And that is if you go up to Halifax, and if you walk up and down the boardwalk, the new boardwalk in Halifax, it's a nice walk. It's like walking through the Hall of Shame, because it seems every 15 feet there is another, in this case, this is a plaque, commemorating what the English did in Nova Scotia, not only during the expulsion time, but other things that the English did during the time of control from 1759 to now, basically, although Canada is pretty much an independent country. But if you look closely at that little plaque, you will see a blue line. And the blue line intersects with the red line. And these are where, if you survived this prison in Halifax, you got out and you got to go around the world. Some of the men got to go to the Louisiana Territory. And why we have Cajun culture today in the United States is they were exiled to the Louisiana Territory, which was first French, then Spanish, then French, and they set up shop. And they kept their culture with them. And to this day, there is the Cajun culture in Louisiana, which comes out of the expulsion back in 1758, 59, 60. The French and Indian War would end in 1763. The English would finally defeat the French in what is now Canada, in those days the Northern Territory, and the Mississippi and the Great Lakes line. The English took Canada. It's all done. It's over. England's got North America. Now what? Well, England had been in wars forever. I mean, and the bills came in, and they needed to look around to see, well, now where can we get money? Where can we get money for all this? So we got to get money to pay back our debt. And they look and they said, hey, wait a minute. We now control North America. Hey, they're rich. Those people they're all landowners, both in Upper Canada or the Northern Territories and the Southern Territories. The Southern Territories, Maine down south to Georgia. Those people are all rich. Hey, I get it. Let's tax them. Washington never did get his commission, despite being the commander-in-chief of all forces in defense of Her Majesty's colony in Virginia. Here's a question for you. When I do this live, I ask this question, but I don't want the answer right now. I want it in a few minutes. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, all these people, traitors or not? Traitors or not? Tell me in a few minutes whether they were traitors. So it's the 1760s and 1770s. The war is done, but there's a lot of tension between the England and the colonists, both the northern colonists, which is now Canada, and also the southern colonists, which is now the United States. And the northern colonists in Nova Scotia are talking to their brethren in New England, saying, hey, all the troops are gone. They're all gone. They're gone. They got the B squad and the C squad and the JV here. We're thinking of breaking away in Nova Scotia. The seed is planted because down in New England, they start talking about, hey, maybe we should become our own country. The Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War. Great Britain has no war for the first time in 50 years. And Parliament decides, you know what? Let's get back to regulating the empire, especially the colonies in North America, because there's a lot of money in North America. British had an enormous debt. Those people in America, or those southern colonists, hey, you know what? Time to pay up. They watch closely in the South, South being Maine South, not the South today. They know England has won in Quebec, and they chased the French from Nova Scotia, and they're gone, and they don't want another war. So time is right to get away from England. 1763, Parliament issues the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited settlement in the American colonies or the southern colonies west of the Appalachian Mountains. You could go to the border there, but you can't go over the Appalachian Mountains. And Washington is not very happy about this. And nor are Virginians, because they want to go west. Go west, young man. Oh, that would come a century later with Horace Greeley. So this is one of the first sticking points. And then in 1765, the English Parliament imposes the Stamp Act for taxing the American colonies. Patrick Henry introduces the Stamp Act Resolves in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Washington's part of it. And the Resolves challenge Great Britain's right to impose the tax. Remember, the tax. Go back to the Treaty of Ostend back in 1652. The Brits said to the Barbadians, or the Loyalists, or the traitors, if you want to call them that, you could have control of the taxes. But they were not going to allow this to happen in North America. Patrick Henry. Maybe it was Patrick Henry who knew about the Treaty of Ostend and talked to Jefferson. In 1776, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, but passes the Declaratory Act, which asserts Great Britain's right to pass any laws governing the American colonies. What happened in 1652 again in Barbados? It's not happening in Barbados, and the colonists are like, hey, why is this happening to us? We don't want this. 1767, Parliament imposes the Townshend Duties Act, taxing the imports of tea, glass, paper, lead, and paint in the American colonies. Washington probably knew that the English had pulled their best troops out of North America, And he's getting a little antsy. After all, he's living with Martha. I mean, you know, he's living with Martha and he's got to stay home, but he also goes away on business occasionally, and he's getting rather antsy, and he's beginning to look for a way out of England, and he wants to form something in his area. By the late 1760s, he experiences firsthand the effects of rising taxes on the colonists, and he came to believe it was in the best interest of the colonists to declare independence from England. So he decides to go on some trips fairly soon. 1767, he opposed the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, as well as the 1774 Intolerable Act. He goes to Pittsburgh, and he has this meeting. And as a reporter, because it's what I do, I'm a journalist, and you know, part of the job as a journalist, you got to eavesdrop. So I decided I was going to eavesdrop between Washington and one of his old allies in the Allegheny area. And in Pittsburgh, of course, when he was there, there was no baseball stadium there or no football stadium behind us. So I'm listening and I'm listening intently to these guys talking. And he's trying to get them to join him to break away from England. 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act. The Boston Tea Party takes place in Boston, Massachusetts. Party of nearly 50 men disguised as Indians led by Samuel Adams, who supposedly liked to drink a little bit, but not the guy who's brewing, not the guy who is brewing beer today. Anyway, they board ships and they break open 343 chests of tea and empty them into the Boston harbor. And if you want to do that today, if you go to Boston, you could do that today for $10. You go on one of the ships and dump tea in the harbor. I haven't done that yet. Maybe one day I will. I have been in that building to the left behind there. That's the Children's Museum, where I took my little kid, my little daughter there when she was 3 months old. Seeking to boost the troubled East India Company, the British Parliament adjusted import duties. Tariffs, I guess. Consignees in Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia rejected tea shipments. Guys in Boston said, you know what, bring them in, drop them off. So they decided to go their own way. But on the night of December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in the Boston harbor and threw the chest of tea overboard. And this resulted in the passage of the punitive coercive acts in 1774. And they were intended to punish the colony in general and Boston in particular, both for the Tea Party and the pattern of resistance it exemplified. Hey, those guys in Boston, hey, they were up for a riot at any time at that point. Now, there is some question in Massachusetts of where the first skirmishes were. Was the first skirmish Lexington and Concord, or was it in the Berkshires on August 16th, 1774? That's the courthouse up in Great Barrington. Near this spot, Great Barrington, Massachusetts, near this spot stood the first courthouse of Berkshire County, erected 1764. Here, August 16th, 1774, occurred the first open resistance to British rule in America. And yet, you hear about what happened over Bunker Hill and Concord and Lexington. But in Western Massachusetts, they claim that the first resistance took place, except the first resistance may have been the Boston Tea Party, or may have been Patrick Henry saying, not give me liberty or give me death, I don't want to pay taxes, which is what he said. So there are skirmishes between British troops and the colonial militiamen, Lexington and Concord, April 1775. So there was a lot of stuff going on in Massachusetts. Washington isn't involved quite yet. The second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia in 1775. Peyton Randolph is reelected the president of Congress. George Washington is named commander-in-chief of the American forces, and Washington wants to battle. Hey, he's been it's been nearly 2 decades since he's been in uniform. So he shows up to this thing in Philadelphia, complete with his old Army uniform on, you know, and he's also 6'4", and he's an imposing figure, and everybody else is maybe 5'10" at best, 5'9", 5'10", and they're looking at him, and he's looking at them, and he's basically demanding that he's the commander-in-chief, and looked around and said, I don't know, you know, hey, he's probably our best choice, so, you know, let's make him commander-in-chief. And he was commander-in-chief because they really had no one else. But meanwhile, the bespectacled George III. George III had really bad eyesight. But he is really upset. You don't want to get the king too upset. But in 1775, he's really upset. And he declares the American colonies in rebellion. Actually, they were the southern colonies. Northern colonies, not rebellion yet. Washington comes in. He's in his military uniform. He's singling, to war, to war. Washington wants to go to war. He had the prestige. He had the military experience. And he had charisma. He had watched the British military tactics back in Barbados, back during the French and Indian War. He knew what their strengths were and what their weaknesses were, and that would prove invaluable during what would become the revolution that would start shortly after the Concord and Lexington skirmishes. The thing about Washington, he didn't win too much, but he was a good field general. He had the ability to keep the struggling colonial army together. They believed in him. The troops were poorly trained. They lacked food. They lacked ammunition. They lacked supplies. Some soldiers didn't even have shoes in the winter, and you've heard about Valley Forge and all that other stuff. But Washington was able to keep them going and motivate them to continue and continue and continue. The other thing that Washington picked up in Barbados would be very valuable to him during the Revolutionary War: smallpox. Once you have it and survive, ain't going to get it again. So while a lot of his troops had smallpox, he was able to carry on. And he wasn't one who sat behind the desk. He was out there on his horse in the middle of battles. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, 1776. That's an old picture from 1997. In 1781, the Americans, with the assistance of the French and others from Germany, beat England in Yorktown. The war is just about done. Amazingly enough, a ragtag army made up of militiamen, not well trained, run by Washington, got a lot of assistance from the French because the French wanted to get back at the English, and they would come in 1778. And people from Germany and whoever else they could find turned back the English. The war is just about done. Washington says goodbye. Where would he say goodbye? He's English. He's in the tavern. Now, let me ask you a question here, and you can put the answers in the chat box. I'm not going through the revolution, obviously, which lasted 76 through 83, but was George Washington a traitor? Yes or no? Is Thomas Jefferson a traitor? Yes or no? Was John Adams a traitor? Yes or no? Was Ben Franklin a traitor? Yes or no? Must have been one hell of a Thanksgiving at the Franklin household because Richard Franklin, Ben's son, was the English appointed governor of New Jersey. But yes or no? Was he, in fact, you can unmute yourself so you can answer the question if you want to. Were these guys traitors? Yes or no? Anybody? We got one, we got one, we got two. Let's see what we got as far as chat. Diana? Yes. Patty? Yes, yes. These guys were traitors. Now, getting back to Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. That was announced by a town crier on July 4th, 1776. Those guys were out of Philadelphia, leaving Philadelphia on the first rail. Of course, there weren't any rails in those days. Get out of Philadelphia, because if they were captured, they were going to be hanged. Now, John Hancock was the richest guy, absolute richest guy in North America, at the insurance company too. And he hated King George III. And you might know in the Declaration of Independence that put your John Hancock there, right? John Hancock, put it right there. Biggest name of Declaration of Independence. Also, Elbert Jerry Eldridge Jerry is on the signed the Declaration of Independence. His claim to fame in the United States is the term gerrymandering, Gerry. He could draw up a district in 17 different ways, and none of the lines would match each other, and that's where we get the term gerrymandering, in case you were interested. But these guys had to flee, and these guys, had they been caught, they would have been hanged. But in Hancock's case, he didn't care. He wrote his name biggest on the Declaration of Independence because he knew George III was very, very nearsighted. And he wanted to make sure that George III saw that he wanted to be away from England. And that's why he wrote his name the biggest of anyone on the Declaration of Independence. They all fled. They went their separate ways. And Washington, of course, leads the army. You know, if you go up the stretches up in northern New York and in Vermont, you don't see anything for miles and miles. There's the Adirondacks, there's the Green Mountains, there are fields. And I was up there a couple of years ago, and my wife's cousin and I were driving through, going into Vermont off of 22. And he said, how did they find each other for battle? Where'd they find each other? You just got these huge expanses, and, you know, did they make appointments? Hey, we're going to be there in a couple of weeks. You know, why don't you come and we can shoot it out? So most of the war would shift to the south after a while. Near where I live, the Battle of White Plains, which was not a good battle. The British actually encamped on what is now Quaker Ridge Golf Course in New Rochelle for the Battle of White Plains, but the war would shift down to the south, and eventually 1781 it was done. So Washington, he's had enough. He is 51 years old by the time the war is officially over, and it's time for him to say goodbye. And that would be in 1783. However, we need a government, right? You got to have a government. So what's the best place to operate a government? A tavern, of course, Fraunces Tavern. That's where Washington said goodbye, and that's where the seat of the government was in New York. And that's where, after the government was done, they'd go downstairs and have a few cocktails. Today, Fraunces Tavern, which you saw right there, is still a bar and a museum, Fraunces Tavern. So, yeah, Michael, you're probably right. They were freedom fighters in a way, their own freedom. But what they really wanted was not to pay any taxes. They were tired of paying taxes. So, you know, they decided to go on their own, rickety as it was, back in 1776. And the only people who counted really as citizens, when you look at the original founding fathers, landowners. Women had no rights. Women had absolutely no rights back in those days. If you were a woman, if you were a landowner and you only had daughters, you had to leave your land to somebody else who had daughters. The daughters were not allowed to own land. The daughters were not allowed to vote in 1776. You know, after the Civil War was done, all men in the United States were allowed to vote. And it took women until 1920 to get the right to vote for president of the United States, until 1920. Women were very, very persecuted in the United States at that time. So Washington decides he's going to go home, hang out with Martha, but there's a problem with hanging out with Martha. He doesn't know if he really wants to do it or not. So he goes to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia, and he is a delegate there. And they say, look, George, we need your help. Can you basically become the president of the convention? After much reluctance, he said, yeah, sure, why not? So he becomes the head of the convention. And then he gets to work, and he literally builds the federal government. Now, he had been the commander-in-chief in 1776, 1783 of the Army and the Navy. And he did not like the Articles of Confederation of the 13 colonies. He thought it was terrible. He thought it was a weak central government. And he said, that weak central government, no more than a rope of sand to support a new nation. There were 13 colonies. There could have been a 14th colony. Because remember, up in Nova Scotia, and if you look at the map now, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are separate, and New Brunswick makes up part of the border of Maine. But it was Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia you got to give them credit for, they were some of the first people to put out that they wanted their own autonomy. And they told it to their brethren in the Southern Territories. So there could have been 14 colonies. And there was some skullduggery that was taking place during the Revolution between privateers and profiteers. And there were some double crosses. And Nova Scotia said, because they had the port, Halifax, which is, even though it's north, I mean, it's a warm weather port. It never freezes, the port in Halifax, because of the Gulf Stream. And so there was some double crossing there. And Washington thought about going after the Brits in Nova Scotia, and he decided, you know, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to spend the money for ammunition. It's just not worth it. Why didn't he spend the money? Couldn't get the money because of the weak central government. He got whatever he got. Pocketed some of it too, apparently, according to his biographies. So he wanted to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. His view, you need a strong federal government. And he found that out firsthand. And he also saw the inability of the Congressional Congress to rally the states to provide money for the needs of the military. The Congress would not come up with money to help out in a time of crisis. I'll leave it at that. And there is Washington in front of Federal Hall, where he took the oath of office in 1787 as the first president of the United States. That's right off Wall Street. In fact, in 1970, there was the Hard Hat Riot there after the Kent State killings, where the Hard Hats decided to go after the so-called hippies. Who were demonstrating. So, and that was organized by one of Nixon's guys, Peter Brennan, who would become the Secretary of Treasury or Labor, Secretary of Labor later on. Anyway, so there is Washington in front of Federal Hall. Washington invents the United States government. It's him, with help from Alexander Hamilton. He appoints all of the high-ranking officials in the executive and judicial branches, shapes numerous political practices. His ally, his right-hand man, before he became famous on Broadway, Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton also knew the value of having money in New York and not needing a capital in New York. Hamilton, it was his economic policies that Washington pushed. The policies whereby the federal government assumed the debts of state governments, which is still being fought over today, as you know, with stimulus packages, and established the first bank of the United States and the United States Mint and the Treasury. Also, the United States Customs Service building, and that is the United States Customs Service building in Lower Manhattan. If you want to go see Hamilton for nothing, go. Well, I don't know if you can do it right now because of the pandemic. It's a beautiful building. I lived on the Lower East Side for a little while in my life when I was a child, and we went there because there's offices there. It was terrible back in those days. But they renovated the place, and it's a gorgeous place, the Customs House, established by Hamilton, who also established the longest running newspaper in the United States when he founded the New York Post in 1803. Washington is considered one of the greatest presidents ever. But his stay in Barbados is really important because of a number of things. He learned all about the British Navy. He entered the British Army out in Pennsylvania and in what is now West Virginia and Virginia. He made allies with some Indians out in the Pittsburgh area. He met a lot of people who would be important in his life, power people, and he stayed in touch with power people. And you gotta remember, this journey starts for Washington, he's 19 years old. John Adams is the next president, then comes Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson was an intellect. And Jefferson studied, obviously, the Treaty of the Treaty of Barbados that was signed in the Mermaid Tavern. And Barbados plays a key role, which you probably don't know, because I was, a couple of years ago, I gave this talk in Glen Rock, New Jersey. And there were a lot of local historians there, Northern New Jersey historians. And only one guy knew of the story of Washington, and this is 40 historians, local historians in New Jersey, some of which run, they were down in Morristown, New Jersey, one of Washington's headquarters, and he runs the Washington headquarters now in Morristown, and they were telling me, we never heard any of this. Nobody has ever told us any of it. I said, you got to go somewhere else. You got to go to Quebec. You got to go to Nova Scotia. You got to go to Barbados. And you got to not want to do the normal touristy things. You want to do something else. So Washington's stay in Barbados is very important to the history of the United States. Jefferson's knowledge of the Treaty of from Ostens, the Charter of Barbados, is influential to his eventual writing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Hamilton also is important as well, but looking at this, you would never know how pivotal it was that Barbados was there. But then again, you look at Barbados at the time, it was the crown jewel. It was the absolute crown jewel of Britain at that time. 1776, the Queen is in Boston on July 4th, 1776. All's well, all is forgiven after 200 years, and why not? The English and the United States are powerful allies. Canada, which basically, the Nova Scotia angle is this. Nova Scotia would become the first province to get autonomy. By 1864, Nova Scotia and Quebec and Ontario would all be, and New Brunswick. Oh, I forgot about New Brunswick. New Brunswick, after the Revolutionary War, the loyalists to King George III fled the United States unless they renounced their citizenship, and they ended up in New Brunswick, which was Nova Scotia cut in half, and they were on the other side, and the other royalists ended up in Kingston, Ontario, named after. In fact, if you want to know about the capital, Ottawa, one of the reasons it was chosen, and this was this real backwards town filled with drunks and prostitutes, but there were 40 miles of maybe malaria between the United States border and Ottawa, which was called Bytown at the time. They put it there because they didn't want to put it in Kingston because it's named after the king. Montreal was too English and French, and Quebec City was all French. You're right, Kent. They really didn't become close because there were battles in the Civil War after the war was over between the United States and Britain around Alaska, and also the Soviets, where the Russians sold the United States to Alaska, or rather Alaska to the United States. And that got the northern colonists all upset because the United States could invade, theoretically, the land from Canada. But you're right about that. But we became allies after a while. Anyway, so the Queen is in Boston, Queen Elizabeth II in 1976. And then she goes to Washington. And she spends time a couple days later with President Gerald Ford. And they toasted one another. A few days later, for the friendship between the United States and England. So Washington, Barbados, and Jefferson a triangle there in a way that you never learned about in school. Any questions or any comments? You can open up your mics now, or I can, yeah, you could open up if you have anything, or type it in. Anybody? Anybody have anything? This is a quiet crowd.
It was nice. Yeah, it was nice to have the history lesson. Thank you.
It's a lesson that you don't necessarily get in school.
Right.
And yeah, there are a lot of people who look at history. Okay, you know, Patrick Henry and all the, where'd they get their ideas? I mean, and why were they doing all of this? And the answer was, there were a lot of things. Liz wants me to rewrite our history books. You know, there is a guy at Boston University named Howard Zinn who actually teaches that kind of history. And if you go to Boston University, you know, look up Howard Zinn, Z-I-N-N, and you'll find some of this stuff. But, you know, I'm fortunate. I travel a lot. And given that I travel a lot, you know, I'm fortunate in finding that, in finding things out. Thank you, Carl. I appreciate that. And hopefully one day
Hey, Evan, how you doing?
Yeah, no, I'm talking to Carl. Hopefully Carl will be sometime in the next year in the same room while I'm talking and you show up. Carl came to the last talk I gave live in Bronxville, right? That was the golf talk?
Yeah, that's right, on golf.
Hey, Evan, how you doing?
That was the golf talk. I think Kent had something to say.
Yeah, my great grandfather, a man named Levi Tuttle, was involved in the Tea Party and the Battle of Breeds Hill on the colony side.
Cool. Do you have any souvenirs from those days? I'm gonna give you a Civil War story. I had a friend by the name of Norman McLean, who passed away about 6-7 years ago. And Norman McLean had a relative named Wilmer McLean. You can look up Wilmer McLean, M-A-C-L-E-A-N, Wilmer McLean. On his land in near Washington, D.C., the Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run was on Wilmer's land. Wilmer decided to get out of that neck of the woods and move to Appomattox. Guess where the Civil War ended? Appomattox. In the front parlor of Wilmer McLean's house. Now, the reason I asked Kent, do you have any souvenirs or anything? The reason that I asked whether you have any souvenirs or not is that the McLean family is still fighting the United States about some of the personal artifacts that were in Wilmer's parlor room, including a desk.
We have Irish royalty in our lineage.
Oh, okay. Well, let me finish this story. Yeah.
And I did some of the ancestry stuff over the summer, but my nieces traced my maternal side all the way back to the 10th century.
Oh, cool. Ken, I'm going to cut you off. Ken, I'm going to cut you off because I want to finish the story here. And I'll talk about that another time.
And here's the thing. Here's the thing that I found when I was doing the ancestry thing. Yeah. Is that all of us, all of the Caucasian people from who live anywhere in the world can trace, if you go back far enough, you're either Dutch, German, or Scandinavian.
Could be. Could be. Let me just finish this story about Norman. And so anyway, the United States, Hancock made his money. he had all kind of businesses in Boston. I don't think he made his money off slavery. He had businesses, as did Paul Revere. I'm going to finish Norman's story. Norman's been dead about 6-7 years now. And we often talked about it. And I said, what happened to the artifacts in Wilmer's parlor room? He said, well, Lee and Grant signed the deal that ends the Civil War on that desk. And they decided, the Grant people decided, hey, you know what? To the winners write history, and to the winners, they get the spoils. And they decided to load up the wagons, literally, and took virtually all of Wilmer's possessions, except his bed. They left his bed there. And so I asked, where's all the stuff? He said, well, we've been suing forever. Norman's son, Alex, is a lawyer who worked for the Bush administration, as a matter of fact. The 43rd, and I've known him since he's literally 8 years old. And anyway, last I heard where the stuff was, it was sitting in a warehouse in Cleveland, Ohio. And they were still battling over whether or not the United States legally had the right, because it was General Grant, to seize all of Wilmer's. He took his desk, he took his chair, he took his, they took whatever wasn't nailed down, with the exception of his bed. Thank you, Michael. We'll see you soon.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Michael's from Milwaukee. We'll be talking.
All right, Evan. Thank you. Good night.
Fan, as a matter of fact. But anyway, they took everything, and they left the poor guy with his bed. And at least they left him with a pension, because he worked for the post office, and he did get a pension back in the 1780s. Now, the rest of the McLean family decided to hightail it out of town. They ended up in Truro, Nova Scotia. And Norman's father decided to come back to the United States. He became a mortician. And Norman became a dual citizen. And he and the rest of the family are fighting over who actually owns Wilmer's stuff. And it's not a museum. I can understand if it was in a museum, but it's not in a museum. Anyway, anybody else?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, who are you? Identify yourself, because I don't know who you are.
Gloria. Hi.
Gloria, okay.
Was it just poetic license that the play Hamilton took? Because they gave Alexander Hamilton a lot of credit for some of the things that you contributed to George Washington. For example, Hamilton also spent time in the Caribbean. I believe they said Barbados, and was influenced by the same.
Yeah, he was born in Nevis. I've never been to Nevis. I've been to St. Kitts, but I've seen Nevis. He was born in Nevis. He ended up in Bermuda. So yeah, but again, that's British territory as well. But no, he did a lot. I mean, and Washington trusted him, at least his professional opinions. I'm not sure about his personal life, which was kind of a mess. And of course ended with Aaron Burr. But Hamilton was the guy who cut the deal with Jefferson. We'll keep the money. Take the government. We don't want the government. We'll keep the money. And they kept the money. And the financial center ended up in New York City. And the government ended up in the swamplands in between Virginia and Maryland. And I know people who told me that it was literally, Washington was a backwater until World War II. That it was just a backwater town that happened to have the capital of the United States. But Hamilton was a brilliant guy. He was an absolute brilliant guy. And at least professionally. Now, as far as some of the judgments he made in life, that's another story. But yeah, I mean, Hamilton did an awful lot, and he's still on the $10 bill. Anybody else?
Yeah, you mentioned that the people responsible for throwing the tea into the Boston Harbor were dressed as Indians.
Yes.
I didn't know that, and why?
Oh, they just wanted to go undercover. They were well known in Boston.
Yeah, but then the Indians would get the blame for it.
Maybe. Samuel Adams. I was on a tour in Boston a couple of years ago, And there's a cemetery next to a church where the entire Franklin family is buried, with the exception of Ben Franklin, who's buried in Philadelphia. And the guy is explaining across the street from that cemetery, Samuel Adams would be yelling. He'd be on talk radio today. He'd be screaming, yelling on talk radio, or maybe cable TV news. And he would be literally yelling at the sky about things that were happening. And but he was rather well known, and all those guys, Revere and John Hancock and John Adams, and all of those guys were very well known in the Boston area. There were no secrets around there. And, you know, Boston's really small. I mean, Boston's not very big, particularly the area that where Paul Revere, one if by land, two if by sea, in this Midnight Ride. It's not, I mean, where Revere's house is to where he rode can't be more than 1.25 miles. So they were all living in this tight little area near Faneuil Hall in the north side. So they really, you know, everybody knew everybody in Boston. It's also by Mike's Pastry. I don't know if you know Mike's Pastry in Boston. It's supposed to be the best pastry place in Boston. Not far from Mama Anna's, where I usually eat when I'm in Boston for lunch. So it wasn't very far. Anybody else? Well, if I got no one else, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Jeannie, for inviting me to the library. And hopefully, since we're in the Westchester area, or I'm in the 914 area, some of you are in the 845 area, hopefully we'll be able to do this in person within a year again. So anyway, thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
And I hope you enjoyed it. And when you think back at elementary school, you'll think back and say, they got it all wrong. They got it all wrong. But history is written by the winners, and it was written by Jefferson and Franklin, and well, Washington really didn't write it all that much, and Adams and Madison and all those other folks in Hamilton, and they were the founding fathers. Anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming tonight, and we'll see you down the line. I got, if anybody's interested, I'm just looking to see what I got going this week, next week. Next week, I got another football talk. I'm doing the calendar year 1968 at the New City Library, and I'm putting up, I'm doing a talk on 1964 tomorrow for the Tenafly Senior Center, but they told me to put it up online, so if you want to just look at my YouTube channel, you'll be able to see the 1964 talk that I'm doing for a group tomorrow that will be put online, and that's all about 64 World's Fair, the Beatles meeting Muhammad Ali, Vietnam, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So thank you so much, and we'll be talking to you soon. Have a good night.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.